Hey, what's going on, everybody? It's the CD guy, Johnny Z here. Thank you so much for tuning back into the channel, and today what I'm going to be doing is 50 albums turning 50, so I'm going to be taking a look at 50 great rock and metal albums that came out in 1974, the best celebrating the 50th anniversary this year. Not going to be ranking them in a traditional sense because that would just be impossible. What I'm going to be doing is going in chronological order of release date, so with that in mind, let's get started. We're actually going to start in February because none of the albums here on my list of top 50 actually come from the month of January. So oddly enough, we're skipping ahead to February for Rock and Roll Animal by Lou Reed. Classic Lou Reed live album here, consisting mostly of Velvet Underground material. It's abrasive and sleazy at the same time. This is just prime Lou Reed on display. Burn by Deep Purple, the first album of the Mark III lineup here of the band. Great reinvention of the Deep Purple sound, marking the debut in Deep Purple of Glenn Hughes and David Coverdale, replacing Ian Gillan and Roger Glover. Fantastic record here. Again, the band reinventing themselves with standout tracks that include Burn, Might Just Take Your Life, Sail Away, You Fool No One, and Mistreated. Next up, we have Self-Titled by Kiss. This is definitely one of their best albums. The band formerly known as Wicked Lester morphed into the hottest band in the world here with this great debut, stacked from top to bottom. The only thing is the production is really flat, so all these songs come off much better live, so hopefully that's nothing that an inevitable 50th anniversary remix and remaster can't fix, but great album. Pretzel Logic by Steely Dan. The monster third album for Steely Dan marked their change from previous releases as the band attempted to, write within the shorter, more radio-friendly format while also incorporating their trademark jazz sound. 50 years later, the album still sounds fresh with its flawless mix of jazz, pop, and rhythm and blues. Moving into the month of March here with Seven by Bob Seger. This is the first Seger album with the Silver Bullet Band, and despite not being a huge commercial success, it's a tight, compact record clocking in at just over 30 minutes here, and I would consider it to be, one of his more underappreciated releases. I really dig it, even though, again, it was not a big commercial success and remains largely underrated. The self-titled debut by Rush, different from any other Rush album, this record lends itself more to the band's hard rock side rather than, the prog side, even though the Canadian power trio would continue to mature in future releases. I think this is a fantastic debut with a great rocking feel to it. I think there's a lot more to this album than, just Working Man. Mirage by Camel, great prog sophomore album here. Camel are such a unique band, and I love the use of flute on this record by Andrew Latimer throughout. It's an absolute prog essential here. The White Rider and Lady Fantasy are two amazing compositions on what I would consider to be Camel's finest hour in the studio. Next is Shinin' On by Grand Funk Railroad. While not as successful as their previous album, We're an American Band, Grand Funk Railroad cut another great record here with producer Todd Rundgren. Great work as well by Mark Farner. This is a prime example of that bluesy, hard rock sound that made Grand Funk Railroad so great. Queen 2 by Queen, containing various different musical styles here, vocal harmonies, and layer overdubs that would, become more of Queen's trademark sound as time would go on. The band proved that they were more than just a flash in the pan with this sophomore album, the first of two to be released in 1974. I'll get to Sheer Heart Attack in a little bit. Despite not being as talked about as some of the more popular Queen releases, I think it definitely holds its own in its catalog, and for me personally, Seven Seas of Rye is a top 5 Queen song. Another self-titled album here, we have Kansas by Kansas, their debut album. I love a lot of the early progressive works from bands like Kansas or Yes or Genesis before they commercialized their sound, and Kansas' self-titled debut is a great example of that. A very ambitious record, I think, for the band at the time. It's a great blend of prog and boogie rock as well. Definitely amongst one of the best prog debuts of the 70s. You have Get Your Wings by Aerosmith. The band got a lot more comfortable with their sound, style, and lyrics here on their sophomore album, Get Your Wings, with tracks on here like Lord of the Flies, Same Old Song and Dance. You have a great cover of Train Kept A-Rollin' and Pandora's Box that cemented Aerosmith as a force to be reckoned with going forward, and then in 1975, they would release the monstrous Toys in the Attic, but I guess that album is, for next year. But still, great second album here by Aerosmith that saw them really maturing in their sound and coming into their own. This was a stacked month. Next, we have Apostrophe by Frank Zappa. It is winter time, so here's your reminder not to eat the yellow snow. This is, of course, the biggest commercial success of Zappa's career, and the Don't Eat the Yellow Snow suite takes up most of side 1. Side 2 features the classic Uncle Remus as well. It's proggy, jazz fusion Zappa at his finest here, and Frank Zappa was so unique and so creative that, it can be a bit overwhelming at times, but this album is, a shining example of the fact that his creativity knew no ends. It's a very creative, different, unique album. Great stuff here by Frank Zappa, turning 50 with Apostrophe. Fantastic stuff. Released on the same day, On the Border by the Eagles, sees the Eagles moving in a more rock direction, moving away from the country rock vibe of their first few albums. It's commercial for sure, and the band would find mainstream success, especially with Best of My Love. This record is tight, it's an easy listen, and would be a stepping stone for, the band's sound to evolve into something much bigger throughout the rest of the 70s. 1974 was a great year for prog, but it wasn't in your face. It was more a year of subtle sophistication for prog rock, characterized by bands like King Crimson, who released Starless and Bible Black. Heavily inspired by the energy of the band's live sets at this time, this record continues King Crimson's dabbling in free improvisation and experimental rock with a great variety of tones that really helped to define this record. End of March into April here with Carolina County Ball by Elf. Ronnie James Dio's work prior to joining up with Ritchie Blackmore and Rainbow with Elf will always remain underrated in my opinion, and Carolina County Ball is a fun record that definitely has its charm. A while back I ranked every Ronnie James Dio album across his entire career. That includes Sabbath, Elf, Rainbow, Solo, all that stuff, and while this is not exactly top shelf Ronnie, I think Elf are wickedly overlooked, and this is a fine example of what their sound, looked like and what Dio was up to before joining up with Ritchie Blackmore. So, celebrating 50 years this year is Carolina County Ball by Elf. Secret Treaties by Blue Oyster Cult. I love the riffage on this album, specifically on tracks like Flaming Telepaths, Astronomy, and Career of Evil. The record captures an otherworldly vibe, and interestingly enough, the band didn't write any of the lyrics on this album, instead turning those duties over to producer Sandy Pearlman, Richard Meltzer, and Patti Smith. Up next, Second Helping by Lynyrd Skynyrd. Second Skynyrd album here. It's not as strong as their debut, in my opinion, but still a great offering from classic Lynyrd Skynyrd. Sweet Home Alabama is, the song that, really became probably their best known work, although I probably never need to hear that song again. No doubt this album helped to cement the band, who were white hot at this point, coming off of their debut and a tour with The Who. This next album was one that was released in April in the UK, but didn't get released in the United States until July. I'm talking about Rampant by Nazareth, working here with Roger Glover once again on production for the last time. Nazareth in the studio, it's not their most consistent album of theirs, but I like the variety that it offers. For example, the album opens with Silver Dollar Forger, a great rocking track compared to the more blues-oriented Loved and Lost and folky Light My Way. 5 albums here from the month of May. First off, we have Phenomenon by UFO. One of the albums inspired Iron Maiden, Steve Harris, to pick up a bass for the first time. Every Iron Maiden fan loves Dr. Doctor because it's a song that plays over the loudspeaker before the best 2 hours in live music as far as I'm concerned, and that was my introduction to UFO, but Phenomenon has a lot more to offer as well, including great tracks like Rock Bottom and Queen of the Deep. Also a significant album in their catalog for being the first with lead guitarist Michael Schenker. Preservation Act 2 by the Kinks. I love a good concept album, and I consider this record to be one of the Kinks' most underrated works as the follow-up here to Preservation Act 1 from 1973. One thing I'll say about this album, I think the material on here is good and full of a lot of really interesting ideas. It just translates much better in a live setting. In for the Kill by Budgie. Some incredible grooves here on this record in classic Budgie fashion. Not their most complex record, but a great rocker of an album, and also super influential. Of course, Metallica would go on to cover Crash Course in Brain Surgery, and a nice bit of trivia here, In for the Kill was covered by Van Halen during their early live sets as well, so very influential album. A lot of tracks on here that would make an impression on bands that would go on to define, 80s rock and metal, so great stuff here by Budgie, early heavy metal in and of themselves, and Burke Shelley will always remain a very underrated musician, the mind behind Budgie, fantastic musician, and In for the Kill, really solid album. Self-titled by Bad Company was the first album to be released on Led Zeppelin's Swan Song Records label. Bad Company's immensely successful debut album is raw, straightforward rock and roll, allowing all 4 members of the band to shine, produced as well by the band. The title track is probably my favorite song from this record here, definitely the darkest on this album by far. It's a great record and probably one of the more marquee releases of 1974. One of my favorites of 74, Diamond Dogs by David Bowie, is classic Bowie through and through here. It almost seemed impossible to follow up the great Aladdin Sane, but Bowie took that in stride, always changing, always staying fresh here, with some great standout tracks that include Future Legend, Diamond Dogs, the title track is great. You have Sweet Thing, Candidate, Rebel Rebel, of course, a classic as well, Rock and Roll With Me, We Are the Dead, Big Brother as well. Fantastic stuff. This whole album, top to bottom, is just prime, classic David Bowie, probably in his creative peak during this era in the 70s, so fantastic stuff, as always, from David Bowie. On to June with Wonderworld by Uriah Heep, the last Heep album to feature bassist Gary Thane. This album sees the band continuing to appeal to a larger audience, larger demographic, while staying true to their sound at its core. Personally, I much more prefer albums like Magician's Birthday or Demons and Wizards, but this album still features one of my all-time favorite Uriah Heep tracks, and So Tired. All in all, strong follow-up here to 73's Sweet Freedom. One thing I love about this time period in rock, and just in music in general, is how, so many of these bands were in their creative prime at this point and would release seemingly classic album after classic album every year. They'd come up with something new and something different. So that's just something you don't see anymore. So next up here, with that in mind, with the Grateful Dead and From the Mars Hotel, which came out less than a year after Wake of the Flood. It was the last album to release before they would go on hiatus in October of 1974. And this is a great display of roots and psychedelic rock here, and slightly more lively than Wake of the Flood as well. Two releases from the month of July to talk about here. We have 461 Ocean Boulevard by Eric Clapton. After taking a 3-year break from, the studio due to heroin addiction, Clapton returned with his second solo album, and it's a laid-back record with some great guitar work, as always, and a lot of memorable tracks on here, in my opinion, like I Shot the Sheriff, Motherless Children, and Let It Grow. How about On the Beach by Neil Young, the second of Neil Young's Ditch trilogy here. The album draws inspiration from Young's feelings of retreat and negativity due to his newfound success after the release of Harvest in 1972. It's a very introspective album and, really showcases some of his best songwriting as far as I'm concerned. Only one here from the month of August that I wanted to talk about, that being Greatest Hits by Alice Cooper. The final release here by the original Alice Cooper group. It's one of my favorite Greatest Hits albums of all time, and, it's all essential stuff from the classic records here by the original Cooper group. I love the cover art here as well. It's, a great beginner's guide to, the early Alice Cooper band, who were in the process here of disbanding during this time period. Alice would come back the next year as a solo artist with his solo debut, Welcome to My Nightmare, but 74, really strong Greatest Hits album with a lot of classics on here. On to September here with El Dorado by Electric Light Orchestra, conceived by Jeff Lynne. This is ELO's first concept album, in a complete sense, and what a great one it is. I love the orchestral elements on this record. It's a very, very diverse album, conveying a wide range of atmospheres. From top to bottom, this album is just perfect ELO and one of the most impactful prog albums of all time, so definitely an all-timer and one of the best from 74 as well. It all started here for Judas Priest with Rock-a-Rolla. I wouldn't consider this to be, top shelf Priest, but it definitely does have its moments. They would really arrive, in my opinion, with their next album, Sad Wings of Destiny from 1976, but this album is a decent launching pad as far as I'm concerned, and when I saw them live back in 2022, I was shocked to hear them break out the title track, Rock-a-Rolla, during their live set celebrating 50 years on that tour. So definitely my favorite track from this record. It's a very strong debut, although I wouldn't consider it to be classic Judas Priest. Late for the Sky by Jackson Browne. I just love the complexity of this album. It feels like every track has a chance to breathe, where ideas are fleshed out very nicely as well. Definitely Browne's most mature work to this point on his third studio album, both musically and lyrically, delving into themes of, identity, loss, among others. Every song in here is great, and I just love that slide guitar on Road to the Sky. Fantastic record. Heroes Are Hard to Find by Fleetwood Mac. Fleetwood Mac prior to the Nicks Buckingham era and classic period doesn't get talked about as much as it should, in my opinion, and Heroes Are Hard to Find is, a very underappreciated album that marked the end of an era for the band, as the addition of Stevie Nicks and Lindsey Buckingham on their next album would take the band to the next level. This album was also the final to feature Bob Welch, who left the band at the end of 1974. This album was released during a time of legal issues, low morale, and affairs, because of course it was for Fleetwood Mac, but they would still manage to release a very strong record here, even if it was, a kind of, I'd say, transitional album, as the band would begin to take a drastic step forward with their next album. The Power and the Glory by Gentle Giant. Gentle Giant are a band that always did their own thing despite never becoming commercially successful. The quality of their music benefited from their uniqueness, and The Power and the Glory is an album that rivals their debut, in my opinion, for the best Gentle Giant record of all time. The concept is really cool here, and the tracks are very cohesive. Of course, with excellent musicianship that's well thought out, with clean production here that really highlights the precision of Gentle Giant. So arguably here, this is the band operating at their best in the studio that, again, like I said, I would rival against their debut. Walls and Bridges by John Lennon. Pretty forgotten then solo album, I think, all things considered. There are some great deeper Lennon cuts on this album. For example, I love tracks like Going Down on Love, Whatever Gets You Through the Night. Old Dirt Road is great. Of course, Number 9 Dream is probably the one song that everybody talks about the most from this album. Nobody Loves You When You're Down and Out, Stealing Glass. So a lot of really fantastic songs on here, in my opinion. This album is pretty experimental for Lennon as well, delving into a number of different styles here, coupled with Lennon's introspective lyrics written and recorded during his 18-month Lost weekend. So really interesting time in his life, really interesting album as well, pretty different from anything else in his solo catalog. October is a stacked month here, starting off with Red by King Crimson, their second album of 1974. This is early progressive metal on display by King Crimson, just much heavier than anything I'd done up to this point at this time. It's downright doomy at times as well, so it's just a testament to the band's range and, being able to, convey such heaviness with their sound. Some riffs on here that are just, and bass lines as well, that are just bone-crunchingly heavy, with some standouts that include Red, Fallen Angel, One More Red Nightmare, Providence, and Starless as well. So awesome album from top to bottom, not a bad song on here. Perfect record by King Crimson. They have a lot of candidates for it, the perfect quintessential King Crimson record, but this one is definitely up there. And again, like I said, probably a very early example of progressive metal. Street Life Serenade by Billy Joel. Though not as strong as its predecessor, Piano Man, this album definitely features a lot of really underrated ideas. Of course, Entertainer is no doubt the highlight of this record, but I also really like the two instrumental tracks as well as the Great Suburban Showdown. It's a lesser talked about album here by Billy Joel, full of deep cuts, offering an interesting contrast from Piano Man, which is loaded with radio and live set staples. So I really like that aspect of this record. Lots of really cool deep cuts here on Street Life Serenade. Next, you got Paper Money by Montrose, the final Montrose album with Sammy Hagar on lead vocals here. Sammy goes out with a really strong album as far as I'm concerned, providing powerful vocals on standout tracks like I Got the Fire, The Dreamer, and of course the title track Paper Money. War Child by Jethro Tull, an album that got a pretty harsh reception upon its release and remained one of Tull's most under-recognized albums. I don't think it's anywhere too close to their best or anywhere near it, but this album is harmless. It has some high spots as well, such as tracks like Queen and Country, Backdoor Angels, Bungle in the Jungle, which is an awesome track, although a bit odd and out of place for Jethro Tull, and Sea Lion as well. My biggest criticism of this record would be its lack of cohesion. I don't think it flows very well. It just kind of feels like a lot of ideas, some of them being better than others, some of them being very good, but a lot of ideas just kind of being thrown at the wall at once to see what sticks. So with that in mind, it's not very cohesive, but I do think it's a really interesting collection of tracks that I enjoy probably a lot more than other people. From Jethro Tull to the Rolling Stones here, let's go with It's Only Rock and Roll. This is a significant album for the Stones. This is the final feature, Mick Taylor. Great blend of blues and rock here, as well as the band branching out and dabbling a bit in, reggae and funk as well. I think this was an important transition album for the band, but the material still holds up, with some standouts on here being If You Can't Rock Me, Ain't Too Proud to Beg, of course It's Only Rock and Roll. The title track has become a bit of a radio anthem. Time Waits for No One is great. Dance Little Sister. If You Really Want to Be My Friend, and Fingerprint File to close things out. Really strong record. Hotter Than Hell by Kiss. In the same vein as their debut album, the production on here is poor, but the material is great and comes off, of course, a lot better live. Despite not yet feeling comfortable singing on lead vocals, Ace Frehley is the MVP of this album, in my opinion, on lead guitar, with some absolutely killer solos and awesome riffs, and for what I believe is the first ever thrash metal song with Parasite. Some other standouts on this record include Got to Choose, Going Blind, great Gene Simmons track, Let Me Go Rock and Roll, Watching You, Strange Ways is just a bone-crunchingly heavy track with Peter Criss on lead vocals. So awesome album here from top to bottom. Early Kiss, the original lineup is pretty untouchable. Supertramp brought prog to a more pop-oriented sound with Crime of the Century, an album that marked their mainstream breakthrough. It has an artistic edge to it with tracks like School, Right Bloody Well, Dreamer, and the title track. Great work here by Rick Davies and Roger Hodgson trading off on lead vocals. I enjoy this album, and I like the kind of variety here and difference as they would begin to kind of mix pop and prog together. November was another huge month with a lot of important releases, including on November 1st the release of Fly to the Rainbow by the Scorpions. As the follow-up to Lonesome Crow, this is the first Scorpions album to feature guitarist Uli John Roth. I think Klaus Meine sounds great on this record, really getting the first opportunity here to highlight his vocal abilities. And I wouldn't consider this to be top-shelf Scorps, although some people definitely would prefer the early stuff with Uli John Roth, who would beg to differ here. Still a very strong sign of things to come on their sophomore release. Sheer Heart Attack by Queen. Queen really arrived with this album as far as I'm concerned. It's all killer, no filler, with strong vocals by Freddie Mercury and an absolute guitar assault by Brian May. This record does not let up at all, with classics here from top to bottom like Stone Cold Crazy, Killer Queen, Now I'm Here, and more. Just fantastic, defining stuff here by Queen, where, like I said, they really went to the next level. 1974 was a very productive year for Deep Purple, first with the release of Burn, then with Stormbringer later on here in November. Stormbringer not as strong in my opinion as Burn, but, great stuff here by the Mark III lineup, has some incredible high points on here in my opinion, like, of course, the title track, Hold On, Lady Double Dealer, Highball Shooter, The Gypsy, and The Great Soldier of Fortune. Great vocals there by David Coverdale. This also would be the final Deep Purple album with Ritchie Blackmore until Perfect Strangers in 1984. Nightlife by Thin Lizzy is, pretty unique compared to the other albums in the Thin Lizzy catalog. This record focuses more on the incorporation of blues and soft rock. It's complex here, but laid back at the same time. But it does have its heavy moments, though, particularly on the track It's Only Money. Featuring some input by John Lennon and Elton John, among others. Goodnight Vienna is a harmless Ringo Starr solo album here with a lot of, charm to it as well. Decent for sure. It's a fun listen with some standout tracks that include Goodnight Vienna, the title track, Husbands and Wives, and All By Myself. The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway by Genesis is the last Genesis record featuring original frontman Peter Gabriel. I'd call it my favorite work of his during his tenure with Genesis. Simply put, this is a masterpiece of a record that was very ahead of its time, with a cool concept, very creative album that I think was a bit misunderstood at the time of its release, but has aged exceptionally well. More great prog here with Relayer by Yes. With the departure of Rick Wakeman, the band would bring in Patrick Moraz, who would come in and with him would incorporate jazz, fusion, and funk. This album consists only of 3 tracks, right? You have side 1, which is 22 minutes of Gates of Delirium. Some very unorthodox drumming on here by Alan White. Probably one of my favorite Yes tracks, I should say, of all time. And like I've said before on the channel, I think proggy Yes is the best version of Yes, and this album is just pure prog and jazz fusion. It's an absolute masterpiece. Last one of November here, we have from November 30th, Desolation Boulevard by Sweet. Their third album, and I think it's the band at their best, in my opinion. Of course, everybody knows Fox on the Run. It's been covered by pretty much everybody, but this record has lots more to offer as well, including Lady Starlight, The 16s, Solid Gold Brass, Turn It Down, and more. We have only one for the month of December. That's Dark Horse by George Harrison. After the release of All Things Must Pass and the notable concert for Bangladesh, George Harrison had a bit of a tumultuous 70s, if not underwhelming at times, but I enjoy Dark Horse. Maybe it's not as strong as his predecessor, Living in the Material World, but I really dig standout tracks on here like Simply Shady, So Sad, and of course Dark Horse. Always like Billy Preston's work on this album as well. There you have it, man. 50 great releases from 1974, celebrating their 50th anniversary this year. I didn't want to rank all 50 because that would just be impossible. It would be a really tall task to do, so I thought it'd be cooler to do a 1974 retrospective of some of the best releases from that year, but I will give my top 10 from, the 50 I've selected here as my favorites, my personal favorites from 1974. So with that said, coming in at number 10, we have It's Only Rock and Roll by the Rolling Stones. Number 9, Mirage by Camel. Number 8, Apostrophe by Frank Zappa. Number 7, The Power and the Glory by Gentle Giant. Number 6, Sheer Heart Attack by Queen. Number 5, The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway by Genesis. Number 4, Burn by Deep Purple. Number 3, Self-Titled Debut by Kiss. Number 2, Red by King Crimson. And number 1, my personal favorite from 74, gotta be Diamond Dogs by David Bowie. So that wraps up this video here. 50 rock and metal albums turning 50 in 2024 from 1974. Looking at this year, this retrospective. Hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, please give it a thumbs up. Subscribe to the channel down below. Turn on the bell for notifications so you never miss a new upload. We have a lot of exciting stuff coming to the channel in the new year that I'm pretty optimistic for. So definitely stay tuned for a lot of cool stuff to come. And of course, please let me know down in the comment section below your thoughts. What are some of your favorite rock and metal albums turning 50 this year from 1974? I want to hear from you. Would you be interested in hearing and seeing me continue this series with other album anniversaries like, 1984, an album anniversary for the 40th anniversary, or, 1994, 30th anniversary, stuff like that? Would you be interested in seeing more videos like this? Please let me know that stuff down in the comment section below. And until next time, it's the CD guy, Johnny Z, signing off. Take care, everybody.